In the beginning, before mortal eyes could perceive the distinction between light and its absence, the multiverse arranged itself into fundamental patterns that would define all existence to come. The material plane emerged from the elemental chaos as a realm of balance, neither wholly ordered nor entirely wild, and in that moment of crystallization, something else took form in the spaces between certainty and void. The Shadowfell was not created by deliberate design or divine command, but arose as an inevitable consequence of creation itself, a dark mirror that reflected the mortal world through a lens of entropy and loss. Where the material plane blazed with color and vitality, this shadow realm absorbed light and warmth, becoming a place where everything that existed in the bright world found its diminished echo. The earliest beings to perceive this plane understood it not as a separate dimension but as a fundamental property of reality, the shadow cast by existence itself against the backdrop of the infinite. The formation of the Shadowfell coincided with the establishment of planar boundaries in the aftermath of the universe's violent birth. When the primordials and gods waged their cosmic war across the embryonic planes, their conflict sent shockwaves through reality that carved permanent divisions between realms. The material plane stabilized first, its substance hardening into the bedrock upon which mortal civilizations would eventually rise. But the energies released during that titanic struggle could not be wholly contained within a single dimension. Excess entropy, the residue of destruction, and the accumulated weight of cosmic sorrow pooled in adjacent spaces, creating pockets of negative reflection. These pockets gradually merged and expanded, forming a continuous plane that ran parallel to the material world, but remained separated by a thin barrier of perception and substance. The Shadowfell emerged from this process as a realm defined by absence rather than presence, by what was lost rather than what was gained. The plane's geography mirrored the material plane with disturbing precision. Mountains rose where mountains existed in the bright world, but their peaks wore crowns of perpetual gloom. Rivers flowed through the same channels, though their waters ran black and cold, stripped of the vitality that gave mortal rivers their life-sustaining properties. Forests grew in patterns that matched their material counterparts, yet the trees stood skeletal and gray, their branches reaching toward a sunless sky like the fingers of drowning things. This mirroring was not perfect or complete. The Shadowfell reflected the material plane as it might have been if all joy and hope had been systematically extracted, leaving only the bare framework of existence. Scholars who later studied the relationship between the planes theorized that the Shadowfell represented a cosmic necessity, a place where the universe could store its accumulated despair and decay without poisoning the realms where mortal life flourished. The first inhabitants of the Shadowfell were not born there but arrived through accident or exile. Creatures from the material plane occasionally slipped through thin places in reality where the barrier between worlds grew permeable. Most who crossed over by chance found themselves trapped in a landscape they recognized but could not truly comprehend. The Shadowfell's oppressive atmosphere weighed upon living beings with physical force, draining color from their flesh and light from their eyes. Those who lingered too long underwent gradual transformation, their bodies adapting to the plane's nature until they became something neither wholly alive nor entirely dead. These early travelers brought stories back to the material world when they managed to escape. Tales of a realm where shadows moved with independent will and the very air seemed to mourn. Their accounts varied in detail but agreed on essential facts. The Shadowfell was a place of sorrow and diminishment, where mortal vitality withered under the weight of cosmic entropy. The plane developed its own native life forms over countless millennia. These creatures emerged from the interaction between material matter and shadow essence, beings that had never known the bright world's warmth. Shadow dragons coalesced from pools of concentrated darkness, their scales absorbing all light that touched them. They differed from their chromatic and metallic cousins, not merely in appearance, but in fundamental nature, creatures of pure negation that sought to spread shadow wherever they flew. Other beings arose through more mysterious processes. The shadow mastiffs hunted in packs across the grey wastes, their howls echoing through valleys where no living thing should dwell. They possessed intelligence of a sort, though their thoughts ran along channels that mortal minds found difficult to comprehend. These native creatures filled ecological niches that paralleled those of the material plane, creating a twisted ecosystem where predators stalked prey through eternal twilight. Death found its earliest foothold in the Shadowfell long before any god claimed dominion over mortality's end. The plane's nature made it a natural repository for souls transitioning between life and whatever lay beyond. When mortal beings died on the material plane, their spirits often drifted through the Shadowfell on their journey to final rest or divine judgment. The plane became a way station for the deceased, a grey corridor through which countless souls passed without truly seeing their surroundings. This traffic of the dead infused the Shadowfell with additional layers of melancholy and loss, the accumulated grief of every mortal who died with regrets or unfinished business soaked into the plane's substance, deepening its connection to death and sorrow. Over time, the Shadowfell and death became so intertwined that separating one from the other proved impossible. The primordial age saw the Shadowfell largely ignored by the gods who divided the multiverse among themselves. The bright deities concerned themselves with the material plane and the celestial realms, while darker powers claimed the depths of the abyss and the hierarchies of the nine hells. The Shadowfell existed in a state of divine neglect, neither wholly claimed nor entirely abandoned. A few powers took passing interest in the plane's unique properties. Shah, the goddess of darkness and loss, recognized in the Shadowfell a reflection of her own portfolio. She established connections to the plane that would grow stronger over the ages, though she did not yet rule there. Her influence seeped into certain regions, creating pockets of absolute darkness where even the Shadowfell's dim light could not penetrate. These zones became places of pure negation, where matter itself seemed uncertain of its own existence. The first great civilization to systematically explore the Shadowfell arose on the material plane in the distant past, long before the rise of recorded history. These ancient people, whose names have been lost to time, discovered techniques for deliberately crossing into the shadow realm. They built crude gates of stone and shadow, monuments that created stable passages between worlds. Through these portals, they sent explorers who mapped the Shadowfell's geography and catalogued its inhabitants. The knowledge they gained proved valuable but dangerous. Shadow magic, the manipulation of the plane's fundamental energies, offered power to those willing to pay its price. Wielders of shadow magic could render themselves invisible, step between planes with ease, and drain the life force from their enemies. But prolonged use of these techniques exacted a terrible toll. Practitioners found their emotions dulling, their capacity for joy diminishing with each spell cast. Many who delved too deeply into shadow magic became hollow shells, technically alive but devoid of anything that made life meaningful. This first shadow-working civilization eventually collapsed under the weight of its own discoveries. The exact sequence of events remained unclear, even to later scholars who attempted to reconstruct the catastrophe from fragmentary evidence. Some accounts suggested that the civilization's leaders attempted to merge the material plane and Shadowfell, believing they could create a realm combining the advantages of both. The ritual they performed succeeded in weakening the barrier between worlds, but produced consequences far beyond what they intended. Regions of the material plane became permanently shadowed, their landscapes taking on the Shadowfell's grey pallor. Conversely, portions of the Shadowfell gained unwanted vitality, erupting in brief flowers of color before collapsing back into darkness. The civilization itself fragmented as its people transformed into something neither wholly material nor entirely shadow. Their descendants persisted in both planes, changed creatures who remembered their origins only in dreams and fragmentary legends. The creator races that followed left their own marks upon the Shadowfell. The Saruk, ancient serpent people who shaped much of the material plane's early history, conducted experiments in shadow manipulation that rivaled anything their predecessors attempted. They sought to create servant races adapted to the Shadowfell's harsh environment, beings that could harvest the plane's unique resources without succumbing to its corrupting influence. The results of these experiments scattered across the Shadow Realm, their descendants still dwelling there in isolated enclaves. The Batrakai, amphibious creator beings who preceded the Saruk in some regions, also dabbled in shadow magic. Their approach differed from the serpent folk's methodical research. The Batraki treated shadow as a tool for transformation, using its properties to reshape flesh and alter fundamental nature. Their greatest achievement, according to fragmentary records, was the creation of a portal network that connected specific locations in the Shadowfell to corresponding sites on the material plane. These portals operated on principles that later scholars struggled to reconstruct, drawing power from the alignment of celestial bodies and the flow of shadow energy through planar conduits. The rise of the giant empires coincided with a period of increased interaction between the material plane and the Shadowfell. The giants, particularly those who aligned themselves with darker powers, recognized the strategic value of controlling shadow passages. They constructed massive fortresses at points where the planar boundary grew thin, creating military installations that could project force into both worlds simultaneously. Giant warlords commanded armies of shadow-touched soldiers who moved between planes at will, appearing from darkness to strike at their enemies before vanishing back into the gloom. This period saw the development of sophisticated planar theory, as giant scholars sought to understand and exploit the relationship between the bright world and its dark reflection. They mapped the Shadowfell with unprecedented precision, creating charts that showed not only the plane's geography but also the locations of temporal anomalies, zones of concentrated death energy, and pockets where reality grew dangerously unstable. The wars between the giant empires spilled into the Shadowfell with devastating effect. Battles that began on the material plane often continued in the Shadow Realm, with retreating forces fleeing through planar portals only to find their enemies waiting on the other side. The conflict left scars across both planes, creating regions where the barrier between worlds had been so thoroughly damaged that reality itself became uncertain. In these wounded zones, travelers might step from bright sunlight into oppressive shadow without realizing they had crossed planar boundaries. The phenomenon caused confusion and tragedy as merchants, soldiers, and refugees wandered unknowingly into the Shadowfell, becoming lost in a landscape that seemed familiar but led nowhere they recognized. Some of these people eventually found their way back to the material world, though they returned changed by their experiences. Others remained in the Shadow Realm, adapting as best they could to their new existence or succumbing to the plane's draining influence. The fall of the giant empires resulted in a period of reduced traffic between planes. Without the giants' sophisticated portal networks and planar expertise, crossing into the Shadowfell became more difficult and dangerous. The knowledge of shadow magic persisted but fragmented, scattered across numerous successor cultures who each understood only pieces of the whole. In this era of diminished understanding, the Shadowfell itself underwent subtle changes. Without constant interference from material beings, the plane's native properties reasserted themselves. Regions that had been transformed by giant magic gradually reverted to their natural state of grey twilight. The fortresses that giants built fell into ruin, their stones weathering under the assault of shadow and time. Yet these ruins did not vanish entirely. They endured as hollow monuments to vanished power, their corridors echoing with the memories of ancient conflicts. The rise of elven civilization marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Shadowfell's history. The elves, with their innate connection to magic and their extremely long lifespans, possessed both the ability and the time required to study the shadow plane systematically. Early elven mages approached the Shadowfell cautiously, aware of the dangers that had destroyed previous civilizations. They developed techniques for temporary visitation that minimized exposure to the plane's corrupting influence. Elven planeswalkers could spend brief periods in the Shadowfell conducting research or harvesting rare materials before returning to the bright world. Their discoveries expanded magical theory considerably, revealing connections between shadow, death, and the fundamental structure of reality that previous scholars had missed entirely. The elven people did not view the Shadowfell as merely a source of magical power. Their poets and artists found in the plane's melancholy beauty a reflection of their own race's complicated relationship with mortality and change. Though elves lived for centuries, they were not immune to death or loss, and the Shadowfell's eternal twilight resonated with their cultural understanding of impermanence. Some elves chose to dwell permanently in the Shadow Realm, establishing small communities in locations where the plane's harshness was somewhat mitigated by magical wards and careful environmental management. These shadow elf enclaves maintained contact with their material world kin, serving as embassies and research stations. Over generations, the elves who lived in the Shadowfell underwent gradual transformation. Their skin took on a grayish cast, their eyes adapted to the dim light, and their temperaments grew more somber. They became a distinct subculture within elven civilization, neither wholly accepted by their bright world relatives nor completely integrated into the Shadow Realm's native ecosystem. The crown wars that devastated elven civilization on the material plane also touched the Shadowfell. As rival elven nations waged their catastrophic conflicts, some combatants sought advantage by striking from the shadow plane. Assassins used shadow passages to infiltrate enemy strongholds, appearing from darkness to kill and vanish before defenders could react. Entire armies occasionally maneuvered through the Shadowfell, attempting to bypass enemy fortifications by moving parallel to the material world before crossing back at strategic locations. These tactics proved effective, but came with significant risks. Military units that spent too long in the Shadow Realm found their morale eroding, their soldiers growing listless and hopeless. Commanders learned through bitter experience that shadow campaigns needed to be brief and focused, with troops rotated back to the bright world regularly to prevent spiritual decay. The wars also produced refugees who fled into the Shadowfell seeking safety from the carnage consuming their homelands. These displaced elves established desperate settlements in the Shadow Realm, huddling together for protection against native predators and the plane's draining atmosphere. Most of these refugee communities failed, their inhabitants either perishing or transforming into creatures no longer recognizable as elves. A few settlements endured through a combination of luck, magical protection, and sheer stubborn determination. The survivors of these communities became the ancestors of the Shadar Kai, a race of shadow-touched humanoids who would play a crucial role in the Shadowfell's later history. The transformation occurred gradually over many generations as isolation, shadow exposure, and desperate bargains with dark powers reshaped these exiled elves into something new. The concluding phase of the Crown Wars saw the deployment of magical weapons whose effects rippled across planar boundaries. When the Dark Elves unleashed their ultimate spell to bring darkness across the elven lands, the Shadowfell absorbed much of that terrible magic. The plane, already aligned with darkness and loss, drew in the spell's essence like a sponge soaking up water. Regions of the Shadowfell that corresponded to the affected areas on the material plane became zones of enhanced shadow, places where darkness gained almost physical substance. These pockets of concentrated gloom persisted for millennia afterward, becoming legendary hazards that even experienced planeswalkers learned to avoid. The Dark Elves themselves, driven underground by the consequences of their actions, occasionally used the Shadowfell as a route between their scattered enclaves, finding the plane's oppressive atmosphere less troubling than the bright world's hateful sun. The rise of human civilization brought renewed interest in the Shadowfell from a culture unburdened by the cautionary tales that made elves and dwarves wary of shadow magic. Humans, with their relatively short lifespans and fierce ambition, approached the plane as a frontier to be conquered rather than a danger to be respected. Early human wizards rediscovered shadow magic through independent experimentation, developing spells and techniques that paralleled elven discoveries but approached the subject from different philosophical foundations. Where elves treated shadow as a fundamental aspect of reality deserving respect and careful study, humans often viewed it as a tool to be exploited for personal advancement. This utilitarian approach to shadow magic produced rapid innovation, but also considerable tragedy, as overconfident mages paid prices they failed to anticipate. The founding of Netheril marked a turning point in the relationship between humanity and the Shadowfell. The Netherese, a civilization of extraordinary magical achievement, possessed capabilities that rivaled or exceeded those of the ancient creator races. Their archwizards developed floating cities that drifted through the sky, demonstrating complete mastery over fundamental magical principles. Inevitably, their attention turned to the planes beyond the material world, including the Shadowfell. Netherese planologists conducted extensive surveys of the Shadow Realm, mapping it with precision that surpassed even Elven charts. They identified locations where the planar boundary could be deliberately weakened, creating portals that required minimal magical energy to maintain. These discoveries enabled Netherese wizards to establish permanent installations in the Shadowfell, research facilities where they could study the plane's properties without the limitations imposed by brief visits. The experiments conducted in these Netherese outposts pushed the boundaries of what shadow magic could accomplish. Researchers discovered methods for extracting pure shadow essence and incorporating it into magical items. Weapons forged with shadow steel possessed the ability to drain the life force from those they struck. Armor infused with shadow properties could render its wearer partially insubstantial, allowing them to pass through solid matter or evade physical attacks. The Netherese also experimented with shadow creatures, attempting to bind them into service as familiars or guardians. These efforts met with mixed success. Shadow beings proved resistant to traditional binding spells, their ephemeral nature making them difficult to constrain. Some Netherese wizards developed alternative approaches, negotiating with shadow creatures rather than attempting to enslave them. These negotiations produced partnerships that benefited both parties, with shadow beings gaining access to material world resources while providing their wizard partners with unique capabilities. The pursuit of shadow magic within Netheril was not universally approved. Certain factions within the floating cities argued that excessive reliance on shadow energy would ultimately corrupt the civilization that depended upon it. These conservative voices pointed to the fate of previous cultures that had delved too deeply into shadow, warning that Netheril risked repeating their mistakes. The debate divided the archwizards along philosophical lines, creating tensions that contributed to the Empire's eventual fragmentation. Proponents of shadow magic countered that refusing to explore any magical discipline out of fear represented a betrayal of the principles that made Netheril great. They argued that with sufficient care and proper safeguards, shadow magic could be wielded without the catastrophic consequences that had befallen earlier civilizations. This faction's arguments prevailed, and Netherese shadow research continued to expand. The goddess Shah watched Netheril's activities in the Shadowfell with great interest. She had long maintained connections to the plane without claiming open dominion, but the Netherese presence provided opportunities she had not previously enjoyed. Shah began appearing to select Netherese wizards in dreams and visions, offering knowledge and power in exchange for worship and service. Some arch-wizards accepted her bargain, becoming her priests and champions. These converts worked subtly to increase Shah's influence within Netheril, promoting shadow magic and encouraging their fellow wizards to delve ever deeper into the plane's mysteries. Other archwizards recognized the danger inherent in accepting divine patronage from a goddess of darkness and loss. They attempted to counter Shah's growing presence through appeals to Mistra, goddess of magic, seeking divine protection against Shah's manipulations. The conflict between Shah and Mistra over Netheril's soul played out across multiple planes simultaneously. In the Shadowfell, Shah strengthened her hold on those regions most frequently visited by Netherese researchers, transforming them into extensions of her divine domain. These areas became places of absolute darkness where Shah's will was law. Mistra responded by empowering her own faithful within Netheril, granting them new spells specifically designed to counter shadow magic's influence. The escalating divine conflict had the effect of drawing Netheril deeper into matters beyond mortal comprehension. Archwizards, who had viewed the Shadowfell as merely another plane to study and exploit, found themselves caught in a struggle between cosmic powers whose motives and methods they could only partially understand. The fall of Netheril in the year that later scholars designated as -339 according to Dela Reckoning sent shockwaves across multiple planes. When the archwizard Karsus attempted to seize divine power by siphoning energy from Mistra herself, his spell briefly succeeded before failing catastrophically. The goddess of magic died, plunging the weave into chaos and causing every piece of magic in Faerun to falter simultaneously. The floating cities of Netheril plummeted from the sky as the enchantments sustaining them collapsed. Thousands died in an instant as stone and flesh met Earth at terminal velocity. The catastrophe's effects reached into the Shadowfell through the numerous portals and planar connections Netheril had established. Shadow installations staffed by Netherese researchers found themselves cut off from the material world as portals collapsed. Most of these trapped individuals perished, unable to survive in the Shadowfell without regular supplies from home. A few adapted, transforming into shadow-touched beings who lingered in the ruins of their research stations. The destruction of Netheril scattered survivors across Faerun and beyond. Some refugees fled into the Shadowfell deliberately, believing the plane offered their only hope of escape from the destruction consuming their homeland. These desperate evacuees carried with them fragments of Netherese knowledge, including theories and techniques related to shadow magic. The refugees who managed to establish viable settlements in the Shadow Realm became the nucleus of what would eventually develop into the Shade culture, a civilization dedicated to reclaiming their ancestors' glory through mastery of shadow. In the immediate aftermath of Netheril's fall, however, these survivors focused simply on remaining alive in an environment that actively worked to extinguish mortal life. The goddess Mystra's resurrection shortly after her death prevented permanent damage to the weave, but the brief period of magical chaos left lasting scars. In the Shadowfell, regions that had been heavily trafficked by Netherese wizards underwent transformations as wild magic interacted with shadow essence. New forms of undead spontaneously generated in these zones, creatures that combined the traditional characteristics of the restless dead with shadow properties. Wraiths gained the ability to step between planes at will. Spectres developed techniques for draining not merely life force but also color and emotion from their victims. These shadow undead spread beyond the zones where they originated, migrating across the Shadowfell and occasionally crossing into the material world. Their emergence created new hazards for anyone attempting to navigate the shadow plane. The Shadowvar, descendants of those Netherese who survived in the Shadowfell, spent nearly 2,000 years rebuilding their civilization in exile. They adapted to their new home through a combination of magical innovation and gradual physical transformation. Prolonged exposure to shadow energy changed them at a fundamental level, granting them abilities that no purely material being possessed. They could see clearly in absolute darkness, manipulate shadow as easily as others worked with clay or stone, and survive for extended periods without food or water by drawing sustenance from the plane itself. These adaptations came at a cost. The Shadowvar lost much of their capacity for warmth and spontaneous joy. Their emotions grew muted, their thoughts turning toward themes of loss and memory rather than hope and future possibility. They became a people defined by what they had lost, forever looking backward to the glory of Netheril while struggling to survive in the present. The Shadowvar's most ambitious project was the preservation and enhancement of a single floating city that had survived Netheril's fall. The enclave known as Shade had been conducting research in the Shadowfell when Karsus cast his catastrophic spell. Its distance from the material plane meant the city's enchantments were not subject to the same sudden failure that destroyed its sister cities. The Shadowvar, who inhabited Shade at the time of the fall, worked frantically to stabilize the city's magic, adapting its systems to draw power from the Shadowfell rather than the weave. Their efforts succeeded, preserving Shade as a functioning enclave within the Shadow Realm. Over the following centuries, this single city became the foundation upon which the Shadowvar rebuilt their civilization. They expanded Shade's population by gathering refugees and survivors scattered across the Shadowfell. They strengthened its defenses against native predators and hostile entities. Most importantly, they developed new forms of shadow magic that incorporated principles their Netherese ancestors never imagined. The Shadowvar's isolation in the Shadowfell lasted for millennia, during which time the material plane underwent tremendous changes. Empires rose and fell, new gods ascended to power, while old deities faded into obscurity. The catastrophe that destroyed Netheril became ancient history, remembered only in scholarly texts and bardic legends. The Shadowvar watched these developments from their shadowy vantage point, using scrying magic and occasional covert missions to monitor events in the bright world. They maintained strict secrecy regarding their continued existence, believing that premature revelation would invite attacks from enemies who might view them as remnants of a justly punished civilization. This policy of concealment allowed the Shadowvar to develop without external interference, but it also deepened their sense of isolation and difference from baseline humanity. While the Shadowvar worked in secret, other beings claimed territories within the Shadowfell for their own purposes. The Shadar Kai, descendants of the elven refugees from the Crown Wars, had evolved into a distinct people with their own culture and values. They served the Raven Queen, a mysterious entity whose relationship to death and fate marked her as one of the Shadowfell's most significant powers. The Raven Queen's rise to prominence represented one of the most important developments in the plane's long history, though the exact circumstances of her ascension remained obscured by conflicting accounts and deliberate mystification. Some legends claimed she had once been a mortal sorceress who achieved godhood through a ritual of extraordinary power and terrible cost. Other tales suggested she was an ancient deity who had ruled over death since the cosmos began, her true name lost when she underwent a transformation that redefined her nature. The truth, insofar as it could be determined from fragmentary evidence, suggested that the Raven Queen's ascension involved the violent overthrow of a previous death god. Nerul, the Grim Reaper deity who had long claimed dominion over mortality's end, held power that he wielded with casual cruelty. He delighted in cutting lives short, in causing grief and loss for no purpose beyond his own amusement. The Raven Queen, whatever she had been before her transformation, viewed Nerul's stewardship of death as an abomination that needed to end. She spent years planning his destruction, gathering allies and resources, studying the metaphysical principles that sustained his divine existence. When she finally struck, the assault combined physical violence with metaphysical warfare. She attacked not merely Nerul's body, but the conceptual foundations of his power, attempting to sever his connection to death itself. The battle between the Raven Queen and Nerul shook the multiverse. The conflict began in Nerul's divine realm, but quickly spilled into adjacent planes as the combatants wielded power sufficient to tear holes in reality. The Shadowfell, with its inherent connections to death and endings, became a major battleground. Entire regions of the plane were devastated as divine energies clashed, creating scars that persisted for centuries afterward. Nerul fought desperately to maintain his position, calling upon every resource at his command. He summoned armies of undead to defend his realm, unleashed plagues that killed thousands of mortals to fuel his power, and struck bargains with other evil deities who saw advantage in preserving the status quo. Despite these efforts, Nerul found himself overwhelmed by an opponent who had prepared more thoroughly and fought with greater purpose. The Raven Queen's victory over Nerul was not absolute annihilation, but something more complex. She succeeded in wresting control of death's primary aspects from him, claiming dominion over the passage between life and whatever lay beyond. Nerul himself was reduced from a major deity to a shadow of his former power, stripped of most divine abilities, and cast into exile. The consequences of this cosmic coup rippled outward from the moment of Nerul's fall. The Shadowfell underwent immediate transformation as the Raven Queen imposed her will upon the plane. She claimed a vast fortress within the deepest regions of the Shadow Realm, a stronghold that existed partially outside conventional space and time. This fortress, known by various names in different cultures, but most commonly called the Raven's Roost or the Palace of Memories, became the new center of Death's administration. The Raven Queen approached her responsibilities with a philosophy markedly different from Nerul's sadistic pleasure-seeking. She viewed death not as a source of entertainment, but as a natural process requiring careful oversight. Her role, as she understood it, was to ensure that mortals died when fate decreed but not before, and that souls successfully transitioned to their appointed afterlives without interference from undead creation or necromantic binding. This mandate brought her into immediate conflict with necromancers across the multiverse, who viewed the creation of undead as a legitimate magical practice. The Raven Queen declared necromancy an abomination, an offense against the natural order that she would oppose with all resources at her command. She empowered her servants, particularly the Shadar Kai, to hunt down necromancers and destroy undead wherever they were found. The Shadar-kai embraced their role as the Raven Queen's enforcers with grim dedication. They ranged across the Shadowfell and ventured into the material plane, tracking necromancers and hunting undead with remorseless efficiency. The Shadar-kai had been transformed by centuries of exposure to shadow and service to their Dark Queen. Their appearance reflected their environment, with skin in shades of gray and black, hair the color of ash or midnight, and eyes that held no color at all. They felt emotions only dimly, their capacity for joy or sorrow severely limited by the plane's draining influence and their deity's nature. What they retained was an intense sense of purpose and loyalty to the Raven Queen. They served her not from love or fear, but from recognition that she gave their existence meaning. Without her divine mandate, they would have been merely another group of shadow-touched exiles struggling to survive in a hostile plane. The Raven Queen's rise to power also affected the Shadowfell's relationship with other planes. She established connections between her realm and the domains of other death deities, creating a network through which souls could be efficiently routed to appropriate afterlives. This cooperation among death powers represented a significant departure from previous practice, when each deity jealously guarded their own mortuary processes. The Raven Queen argued successfully that collaboration served everyone's interests by preventing souls from being lost or corrupted during transition. Her initiative resulted in the creation of what became known as the Fugue Plane, a way station where souls awaited judgment and assignment. The Fugue Plane existed partially within the Shadowfell and partially in other planes simultaneously, a metaphysically complex space that reflected its creator's sophisticated understanding of planar mechanics. Not all powers accepted the Raven Queen's authority graciously. Orcus, demon prince of undeath, viewed her anti-necromancy stance as a direct attack on his portfolio and interests. He commanded vast armies of undead and counted necromancers among his most devoted worshippers. The Raven Queen's campaign against undead creation threatened to undermine his power base substantially. Orcus responded by increasing his own activities, creating more undead and empowering additional necromancers specifically to defy the Raven Queen's prohibition. The conflict between these two powers became one of the defining features of the Shadowfell's political landscape, a cold war that occasionally erupted into open violence when their servants encountered each other. The Shadowfell also hosted darker entities whose origins predated the Raven Queen's ascension and whose nature remained mysterious even to beings of considerable power. The Dark Powers, entities of malevolent intelligence that governed the domains of dread, maintained presence within the Shadow Plane. These beings operated according to principles that other powers found difficult to comprehend. They selected individuals who committed particular heinous acts and imprisoned them within pocket dimensions called domains, transforming the guilty parties into Dark Lords who ruled over nightmare realms while simultaneously being tormented by their own crimes. The relationship between the domains of dread and the broader Shadowfell was complex and ambiguous. Some scholars argued that the domains existed within the Shadow Plane, occupying specific geographical locations that could be reached through conventional travel. Others insisted the domains were separate dimensions that merely used the Shadowfell as a convenient access point. The establishment of the domains of dread created hazards for travelers in the Shadowfell. Mists would sometimes rise without warning, thick gray fog that obscured vision and confused direction. Those caught in these mists often found themselves transported to one of the nightmare domains, where they became pawns or victims in the Dark Lord's eternal torment. Escape from a domain once trapped proved extremely difficult, requiring either the Dark Lord's permission or the intervention of powers strong enough to override the Dark Power's will. Many who entered the mists were never seen again, their fates remaining unknown to those who waited for their return. The phenomenon created zones within the Shadowfell that even experienced planeswalkers learned to avoid, regions where the mists appeared with disturbing frequency. The city of Gloomwrought emerged as the Shadowfell's most significant urban center during this period. Located in a relatively stable region of the plane, Gloomwrought served as a neutral ground where various factions could interact without immediately resorting to violence. The city's founding was attributed to a coalition of Shadar-kai, Shadovar explorers, and other shadow-adapted peoples who recognized the value of a permanent settlement. Gloomwraught's location was chosen carefully, positioned at the intersection of several major planar pathways that made it easily accessible from multiple directions. The city grew slowly but steadily as word of its existence spread through the Shadow Realm and beyond. Merchants arrived carrying goods from the material plane and other dimensions, seeking the rare materials and unique services only available in the Shadowfell. Gloomwraught's architecture reflected its environment, buildings constructed from dark stone and shadow-infused materials that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The streets followed winding patterns that confused outsiders but made perfect sense to longtime residents. Visitors reported feeling constantly watched while walking through the city, though they could rarely identify the source of their unease. The sensation resulted from a combination of factors including the numerous Shadar Kai guardians who monitored all activity, the presence of shadow creatures that lurked in alleys and darkened corners, and the city's inherent connection to the Raven Queen's divine awareness. Nothing that occurred within Gloomwraught's walls escaped her attention entirely, a fact that both reassured her worshippers and discomfited others. The city hosted temples and shrines to various deities who maintained presence in the Shadowfell. The Raven Queen's temple dominated the religious landscape, a massive structure of black stone that rose higher than any other building. Shah maintained several shrines throughout the city, smaller establishments that nevertheless attracted steady streams of worshippers. Other dark powers had representations as well, though most kept low profiles to avoid provoking the Raven Queen's displeasure. The religious diversity created a surprisingly cosmopolitan atmosphere despite the plane's oppressive nature. Priests of different faiths could be seen debating theology in taverns or collaborating on magical research, their normal enmities temporarily set aside within Gloomwraught's boundaries. The city's markets became legendary among planar travelers for the exotic goods available there. Merchants sold shadow silk that could render its wearer invisible in dim light. Alchemists offered potions brewed from shadow essence that granted temporary abilities such as incorporeality or immunity to fear. Weaponsmiths forged blades from metals found only in the Shadowfell, tools that could harm incorporeal creatures as easily as solid flesh. The market also hosted darker trades. Necromancers who somehow avoided the Raven Queen's prohibition sold components harvested from intelligent undead. Memory merchants offered to extract and bottle specific recollections, creating commodities that could be experienced by anyone who purchased them. Soul brokers operated in the shadows, facilitating transactions between mortals desperate enough to sell portions of their spiritual essence and entities willing to pay for such forbidden goods. The spell plague that erupted in 1385 Dala Reckoning sent catastrophic effects rippling across the multiverse. When Sirik and Shah successfully murdered Mystra, the goddess of magic, the weave collapsed completely rather than merely faltering as it had during Karsus's folly. Magic became wildly unpredictable throughout the material plane and connected dimensions. The Shadowfell, despite being a separate plane, was not immune to the chaos. The numerous portals and planar connections linking the Shadow Realm to the material world became unstable, opening and closing randomly or leading to unexpected destinations. Travelers attempting to cross between planes during this period often found themselves lost in the spaces between dimensions or emerging in locations vastly distant from their intended targets. The spell plague also affected the Shadowfell's fundamental nature. Regions of the plane began merging with corresponding areas on the material plane, creating zones where the boundary between worlds became dangerously permeable. These shadow-blighted lands exhibited characteristics of both dimensions simultaneously. Buildings stood in perpetual gloom despite the sun's presence in the sky. Living creatures found themselves coexisting with shadow doubles that mimicked their actions with disturbing precision. The merging caused tremendous suffering as people trapped in these hybrid zones underwent gradual transformation, their bodies and minds adapting to accommodate influences from both planes. Many died during the process, unable to survive the strain of simultaneous existence in two realities. Those who survived emerged changed, neither wholly material nor entirely shadow. The Shadowvar chose the chaos of the spell plague as the moment to end their long concealment. They brought the floating city of Shade back to the material plane, emerging from the Shadowfell after millennia of exile. The city appeared in the sky above the Anorok Desert, a massive structure of dark stone and shadow magic that cast an even darker shadow across the sands below. The Shadowvar's return shocked the nations of Faerun, who had believed the heirs of Netheril long dead. The princes of Shade quickly moved to establish their people's position, using military force and diplomatic maneuvering to carve out territory and influence. They claimed to be saviors who would help restore order in the wake of the Spell Plague's devastation, but their true motives went far beyond altruism. The Shadowvar sought to rebuild Netheril's empire, expanding their control across Faerun through a combination of conquest and manipulation. They possessed capabilities that contemporary nations struggled to counter, including sophisticated shadow magic that had been refined over 2,000 years of development. The Princes of Shade could travel instantly across vast distances by stepping through the Shadowfell. Their armies included shadow-touched warriors who could become incorporeal at will, passing through defenses and striking from unexpected angles. These advantages allowed the Shadowvar to achieve rapid initial successes, seizing control of strategic locations and resources. However, their campaign also created numerous enemies who recognized the threat posed by this returned evil empire. The Shadowvar's activities affected the Shadowfell directly through their use of the plane as a strategic resource. They established new installations throughout the Shadow Realm, fortified positions from which they could project power into the material world. They also attempted to strengthen their control over the planar boundary itself, conducting rituals designed to make crossings between worlds easier for Shadowvar while denying access to their enemies. These efforts brought them into conflict with the Raven Queen, who viewed the Shadowvar's large-scale manipulation of death energy and shadow essence as disruption of the natural order. Tensions between the returned Netherese and the Queen of Ravens escalated as both sides refused to compromise their objectives. The Sundering, a period of cosmic realignment that began in 1482 Della Reckoning, undid many changes that the Spell Plague had wrought. The gods themselves intervened in mortal affairs with unprecedented directness, working to restore natural order and repair damage to the multiverse. In the Shadowfell, the Sundering resulted in the separation of regions that had merged with the material plane during the Spell Plague. The shadow-blighted lands were pushed back into their proper dimension, though the experience left lasting trauma on those who had endured the merging. The planar boundary strengthened considerably, returning to something approximating its pre-Spell Plague stability. Portals that had behaved erratically for nearly a century resumed functioning predictably, allowing controlled travel between dimensions. The Shadowvar did not survive the Sundering intact. Their aggressive expansion and manipulation of primordial forces drew retaliation from multiple powers, including Elminster, the legendary wizard who commanded resources accumulated over centuries of life. In a climactic confrontation, Elminster brought the floating city of Shade crashing down into the earth, destroying the city and killing thousands of Shadowvar in the process. The survivors scattered, some fleeing back into the Shadowfell to hide in the ruins of ancient installations, others attempting to integrate into surface societies by concealing their heritage. The dream of restoring Netheril died with Shade's fall, though isolated groups of Shadowvar still clung to fragments of their ancestors' knowledge and ambitions. The Shadowfell emerged from the Sundering changed but intact. The plane's fundamental nature remained as it had always been, a realm of darkness and loss that mirrored the material world through a grey filter. The major powers that claimed territory within the Shadow Realm maintained their positions. The Raven Queen continued her oversight of Death's transition, her Shadarkai servants hunting undead and necromancers with undiminished zeal. Orcus persisted in his defiance, creating undead and empowering his cultists in direct opposition to the Raven Queen's prohibition. The dark powers remained inscrutable, their domains of dread continuing to trap the guilty and the unfortunate in nightmare realms. Gloomwrought endured the tumultuous century with remarkable stability. The city's status as neutral ground had been tested repeatedly during the Spell Plague and its aftermath, but the ruling council managed to maintain order through a combination of force and careful diplomacy. The return of planar stability brought renewed trade to the city's markets, as merchants who had avoided the Shadowfell during the period of chaos returned to conduct business. New factions established themselves within Gloomwraught's walls, including refugees from Shade who sought to preserve what remained of their culture, and representatives from material plane nations interested in monitoring activity within the Shadow Realm. The relationship between the material plane and the Shadowfell entered a new phase in the aftermath of the Sundering. With the boundary between worlds restored to stability, crossings became safer and more predictable. This accessibility increased traffic between planes as adventurers, researchers, and fortune seekers ventured into the Shadow Realm in greater numbers than previous eras had seen. Most who made the journey came seeking specific goals rather than general exploration. Some hunted for rare materials that existed only in the Shadowfell's unique environment. Others pursued knowledge available nowhere else, studying the plane's properties or consulting with entities who dwelt there. A few arrived as refugees, fleeing persecution or justice in the material world, hoping to disappear into the Shadowfell's grey wastes. This increased contact brought both benefits and problems. The Shadowfell's economy grew as demand for its unique resources increased. New communities established themselves in relatively safe locations, outposts that served travelers and exploited local opportunities. However, greater accessibility also meant that dangers from the Shadow Realm could more easily reach into the material world. Shadow creatures occasionally crossed through portals, either deliberately or by accident, causing havoc until they could be destroyed or driven back. Undead generated in the Shadowfell's death-soaked environment sometimes wandered through dimensional weak points, appearing in material plane locations far from any known graveyard or necromancer's lair. The modern era saw the development of organized efforts to study and monitor the Shadowfell systematically. Magical academies on the material plane established research programs dedicated to planar theory, with the Shadow Realm receiving significant attention due to its accessibility and proximity. These academic initiatives produced detailed maps of the plane's geography, catalogues of its native creatures, and theoretical frameworks for understanding its relationship to death, entropy, and the fundamental structure of reality. The research was not purely theoretical. Practical applications of shadow magic continued to attract interest from military organizations and individual spellcasters seeking competitive advantage. The ethical debates that had divided Netherill's archwizards continued in new contexts, with modern scholars arguing over whether the pursuit of shadow magic's power justified its risks. The Raven Queen's philosophy regarding death and the proper treatment of souls gained adherents beyond her traditional base among the Shadakai. Clerics and paladins from various races began worshipping the Queen of Ravens, drawn to her message that death served a necessary purpose and should be neither feared nor perverted. These converts established temples in material plane cities, bringing the Raven Queen's faith to populations who had previously known her only through frightening tales. The expansion of her worship strengthened her divine power and increased her ability to intervene in mortal affairs. She used this enhanced capability to intensify her campaign against undead, granting her faithful new spells and abilities specifically designed to destroy the unliving. Necromancers and their undead servants found themselves under increasing pressure as the Raven Queen's influence grew. What had once been a tolerated, if morally questionable practice became actively persecuted in regions where her faith held significant sway. Necromancers adapted by concealing their activities more carefully, conducting their research in hidden laboratories rather than openly advertising their services. Some fled to nations or regions where the Raven Queen's influence remained weak, establishing enclaves where necromancy could be practiced without fear of holy retribution. Others abandoned the art entirely, recognizing that the risks had grown too great. The reduction in necromantic activity produced measurable effects, with populations of intelligent undead declining in areas where the Raven Queen's followers operated actively. The dark powers' domains of dread continued to pose challenges for those seeking to understand the Shadowfell's full nature. The domains remained stubbornly resistant to systematic study, their internal rules and properties varying wildly from one prison realm to another. Scholars who attempted to catalogue the domains discovered that new ones occasionally appeared while others vanished, suggesting that the dark powers operated according to criteria no mortal fully comprehended. The most disturbing aspect of the domains was their apparent purposefulness. Each domain seemed designed to torment its Dark Lord in specific ways, related to their original crimes and character flaws. This customization implied intelligence and intent behind the dark powers, though attempts to communicate with these entities or learn more about them invariably failed. Adventurers who explored the Shadowfell in the modern era encountered a plane that retained all its original dangers while presenting new opportunities. The ruins of ancient civilizations dotted the landscape, offering treasure to those brave or foolish enough to loot them. Netherese installations held artifacts of tremendous power alongside death traps that had killed countless looters. Elven settlements, abandoned during the Crown Wars, contained libraries of ancient lore and magical items crafted by master artisans. The risks involved in such expeditions were substantial. Native creatures viewed intruders as prey or threats. Environmental hazards ranged from zones of magical distortion to regions where reality itself grew unstable. The plane's draining atmosphere posed a constant challenge, wearing down even experienced travelers if they remained too long without magical protection. The Shadowfell's influence extended beyond its boundaries through the phenomenon of shadow crossing. Locations on the material plane that experienced great tragedy or loss sometimes developed connections to the shadow realm. These tainted sites took on characteristics of the Shadowfell, growing darker and more oppressive. Vegetation in such areas withered and grayed. Water turned cold and lifeless. The atmosphere became heavy with unspoken grief. People who spent too much time in shadow-crossed locations reported experiencing emotional numbness and recurring nightmares. The phenomenon created pockets of shadow influence scattered across the material world, places where the boundary between dimensions had been weakened by accumulated suffering. Shadow magic practitioners in the modern era had access to techniques and understanding that would have amazed even the most accomplished Netherese archwizards. Contemporary spellcasters could manipulate shadow with precision that previous generations achieved only through crude trial and error. They developed spells that allowed temporary transformation into shadow form, granting incorporeality without the permanent changes that prolonged Shadowfell exposure produced. They created shadow duplicates that could act independently while remaining under their creator's control. They learned to store objects and even living creatures within pocket dimensions carved from shadow stuff, retrieving them at will. These advances in shadow magic theory resulted from accumulated knowledge passed down through generations and the contributions of scholars who approached the subject with rigor and creativity. The relationship between shadow and death remained central to the Shadowfell's identity. The plane served as a crucial component in the cosmos's death and rebirth cycle, processing souls and maintaining the boundary between life and whatever lay beyond. The Raven Queen's stewardship ensured that this function operated smoothly, but she was not the only power involved in death's administration. Other deities maintained their own procedures and pathways for their worshippers' souls. The fugue plane, where souls awaited judgment, continued to operate as a sorting mechanism, routing the deceased to appropriate afterlives based on their faith, deeds, and alignment. The system was imperfect, occasionally allowing souls to slip through cracks or be claimed by powers who had no legitimate right to them. These failures, though relatively rare, created opportunities for necromancers and other entities seeking to exploit loopholes in death's bureaucracy. The Shadar-kai evolved in the modern era from mere servants of the Raven Queen into a more diverse culture with its own internal divisions and perspectives. While many Shadar-kai remained devoted to their goddess and her mission, others questioned whether absolute dedication to a single deity truly served their people's best interests. These dissidents argued that the Shadar-kai should develop their own identity separate from the Raven Queen's shadow, establishing goals beyond merely hunting undead and serving divine mandates. The debate created tensions within Shadar-kai society, particularly in Gloomwrought, where exposure to other cultures and ideas encouraged independent thinking. The Raven Queen tolerated this dissent to a degree, recognizing that forcing absolute conformity might drive her people into outright rebellion. However, she also made clear that direct defiance of her will would be punished severely. The phenomenon of shadow-touched individuals became more common as contact between planes increased. People who spent significant time in the Shadowfell, or who were born to parents with shadow exposure, sometimes manifested unusual abilities and characteristics. Their eyes might see clearly in absolute darkness. Their touch might drain warmth from objects or living beings. They could sometimes step between shadows as if the intervening distance did not exist. These shadow-touched individuals occupied an ambiguous position in material plane societies. Some communities welcomed them, recognizing their abilities as useful tools. Others reacted with suspicion or hostility, viewing shadow-touched people as corrupted or dangerous. The prejudice forced many to conceal their nature or seek refuge in places like Gloomrot, where being different was normal. The Shadowfell's influence on art and culture throughout the cosmos proved surprisingly significant. Poets and musicians drew inspiration from the plane's melancholy beauty, creating works that explored themes of loss, memory, and entropy. Visual artists attempted to capture the unique quality of shadow light in paintings and sculptures. Philosophers used the Shadowfell as a metaphor when discussing dualism, the relationship between substance and void, and the inevitable decline that awaited all created things. This cultural influence meant that even people who never visited the plane and had no direct connection to it nevertheless carried the Shadowfell's conceptual weight in their worldviews and artistic expressions. The plane's role in planar travel networks made it strategically important to anyone seeking to move quickly across the multiverse. Experienced planeswalkers used the Shadowfell as a shortcut between distant locations on the material plane, exploiting the correspondence between the plane's geographies. A journey that might require weeks of conventional travel could be accomplished in days by crossing into the Shadow Realm, traversing the equivalent distance there where physical obstacles were often less substantial, then returning to the material world at the destination. This technique carried risks beyond normal Shadowfell exposure. Travelers could easily become lost if their navigation proved faulty. They might encounter hostile entities or stumble into one of the nightmare domains. Despite these dangers, the time savings made Shadowplane travel attractive to those with sufficient skill and desperation. The Shadowfell's marketplaces extended beyond Gloomrot to include numerous smaller trading posts scattered across the plane. These outposts served travelers and local populations, offering basic supplies and services. Some specialized in particular types of goods or catered to specific clientele. One remote outpost gained notoriety for serving as a neutral meeting ground where representatives from opposing factions could negotiate without fear of ambush. Another became known for its library of planar lore, accumulated over centuries by a collective of scholar merchants who traded in information as readily as physical goods. These smaller settlements contributed to the Shadowfell's increasing integration into broader planar society, transforming it from a feared wasteland into a region that, while still dangerous, offered opportunities for those willing to accept the risks. The study of shadow creatures advanced considerably as researchers gained better access to living specimens. Wizards learned to communicate with shadow dragons, discovering that these beings possessed intelligence equal to their chromatic and metallic cousins, but fundamentally different philosophical perspectives. Shadow dragons viewed existence through a lens of entropy and decline, seeing beauty in things falling apart rather than coming together. They collected treasures not for their own sake, but as monuments to lost civilizations and failed dreams. Shadow mastiffs proved capable of bonding with humanoid partners under specific circumstances, serving as loyal companions despite their alien nature. These bonds required handlers who could accept the mastiff's inherent darkness without attempting to change or redeem it. The Shadowfell's ecology, long considered barren and lifeless by those who knew it only superficially, revealed itself to be far more complex than initial assessments suggested. The plane supported food webs where energy flowed through cycles of consumption and decay. Shadow plants absorbed trace nutrients from the gray soil and faint illumination from the perpetually clouded sky. Herbivores, or what passed for them in the Shadow Realm, consumed these plants despite their minimal nutritional value. Predators hunted the herbivores, draining not merely flesh but the vital essence that animated their prey. Death fed back into the system as decomposition returned matter to the soil and liberated trapped energy for reabsorption. The entire process operated at a diminished level compared to material plane ecologies, everything slower and more efficient out of necessity. The relationship between the Shadowfell and the Feywild, its luminous counterpart on the opposite side of the material plane, fascinated planar theorists. Where the Shadowfell represented diminishment and loss, the Feywild embodied enhancement and exaggeration. The two planes functioned as cosmic opposites, while maintaining similar structural relationships to the material world. Some scholars proposed that they had originated simultaneously as twin reflections of the material plane's emergence, while others argued for sequential creation with one arising in response to the other's existence. Attempts to determine which theory was correct through empirical research proved inconclusive. What remained clear was that the Shadowfell and Feywild were intrinsically linked despite their opposed natures, two halves of a broader pattern that helped define the multiverse's fundamental architecture. The modern Shadowfell hosted diplomatic missions from various material plane nations who recognized the value of maintaining official presence in the Shadow Realm. These embassies, primarily concentrated in Gloomwrought, facilitated communication between governments and shadow powers, while providing assistance to their citizens who traveled to the plane. The diplomatic corps, assigned to shadow duty, faced unique challenges. The plane's atmosphere affected even protected individuals over time, making lengthy postings inadvisable. Diplomats rotated frequently to prevent the psychological deterioration that afflicted those who spent too long in the gloom. Despite these difficulties, competition for shadow assignments remained intense among diplomatic services because successful tenure often led to rapid advancement. The experience and contacts gained through shadow duty proved valuable in ways that conventional postings could not match. The Church of Shah, though diminished from its peak influence, retained significant presence within the Shadowfell. The goddess of darkness and loss claimed numerous sites throughout the plane as sacred ground, including several massive temple complexes that rivaled anything on the material plane. Her priests conducted rituals designed to spread darkness and diminish joy wherever they could reach. This agenda brought them into regular conflict with the Raven Queen's followers, despite both groups drawing power from related concepts. The key difference lay in their respective approaches. Where the Raven Queen viewed death and darkness as natural processes requiring management, Shah sought to actively increase suffering and loss beyond what nature would produce unaided. This fundamental philosophical divide made lasting peace between their churches impossible. The phenomenon of shadow haunting affected certain individuals who had spent time in the Shadowfell but returned to the material plane. These people found themselves unable to fully shake off the Shadow Realm's influence even after leaving. They experienced persistent melancholy that no amount of pleasant circumstances could entirely dispel. Their dreams transported them back to grey landscapes they had left behind. Sometimes they perceived shadow versions of people and places, transparent overlays that existed in the Shadowfell appearing faintly visible in the material world. Most cases of shadow haunting eventually faded as time and distance weakened the connection. A few persisted indefinitely, leaving victims permanently changed by their exposure. These chronic cases sometimes found purpose serving as mediums or intermediaries, their dual-world perception allowing them to detect planar instabilities and communicate with entities that others could not perceive. The Shadowfell's connection to memory and forgetting made it a site of particular interest to those seeking to preserve or destroy knowledge. Certain rituals allowed casters to encode memories directly into shadow essence, creating repositories that could survive indefinitely if properly maintained. Libraries of shadow-bound memories accumulated in hidden vaults throughout the plane, containing knowledge ranging from mundane daily life of vanished civilizations to arcane secrets powerful enough to reshape reality. Access to these repositories was carefully controlled by their guardians, who recognized both the value and danger of the information they protected. Conversely, individuals seeking to permanently erase memories sometimes journeyed to the Shadowfell to conduct rituals of forgetting releasing unwanted recollections into the plane where they would dissolve into general melancholy. The economic value of Shadowfell resources created industries dedicated to harvesting and processing shadow materials. Shadow silk, woven from the cocoons of creatures native to the plane, commanded extraordinary prices in material plane markets. The substance possessed unique properties that made it valuable for both practical and magical applications. Armor lined with shadow silk granted enhanced protection against death magic and negative energy. Clothing made from it allowed wearers to blend into darkness with supernatural effectiveness. The harvesting process carried significant risk, as the creatures producing shadow silk defended their cocoons aggressively. Professional harvesters developed specialized techniques for approaching the creatures safely, but casualties remained common enough to keep prices elevated. The Shadowfell's modern political landscape was fragmented, with no single power exercising universal authority. The Raven Queen controlled the largest territory and commanded the most devoted following, but significant portions of the plane remained outside her direct influence. Orcus maintained his enclaves where undead gathered in disturbing numbers. The dark powers governed their domains according to rules comprehensible only to themselves. Various other entities, some of divine or demonic origin and others representing powers entirely unique to the Shadow Realm, claimed territories and exercised local control. This political fragmentation prevented any faction from dominating the plane entirely, while ensuring that conflict remained a constant feature of shadow politics. The question of whether life could truly flourish in the Shadowfell continued to provoke debate among scholars and settlers alike. Optimists pointed to successful communities like Gloomwrought as evidence that with sufficient will and magical support, people could build lives in the Shadow Realm that, while different from material world existence, nevertheless possessed meaning and value. Pessimists argued that such settlements merely postponed inevitable decline, that prolonged exposure to the plane's nature would eventually corrupt even the most carefully protected communities. The truth likely lay between these extremes. Life in the Shadowfell required constant effort and vigilance to maintain. It demanded acceptance of limitations and losses that material world dwellers never confronted, but for those willing to pay the price, the plane offered opportunities for power, knowledge, and purpose that could not be found elsewhere. The Shadowfell stands today as one of the most significant planes in the D&D multiverse, a realm that has evolved from cosmic accident into a complex dimension with its own history, cultures, and political structures. Its influence extends far beyond its borders, through the souls that pass through it, the shadow magic wielded by countless spellcasters, and the memories preserved in its grey substance. The plane remains dangerous and unwelcoming to casual visitors, but its hostility has not prevented the determined from making their mark upon it. From the Raven Queen's fortress to Gloomwraught's markets, from the nightmare domains to the scattered ruins of Netherese ambition, the Shadowfell contains multitudes within its grey expanse. It serves as reminder that even in darkness and loss, significance can be found for those willing to look beyond surface emptiness to the patterns and purposes that lie beneath. The story of the Shadowfell continues to unfold as new powers rise, old conflicts persist, and mortals from across the multiverse venture into its gloom, seeking whatever treasures or truths they believe wait in the shadows.